December 15, 1944. Snow falls heavy across Texas farmland, muffling the sound of truck engines and boots on frozen ground. At a small prisoner-of-war camp outside Fredericksburg, local farmers gather to watch 12 German prisoners step down from military transport, but they freeze in shock. 4 of them are women in torn Wehrmacht uniforms, their faces hollow with exhaustion and defeat. These enemy soldiers had been told Americans were ruthless conquerors who showed no mercy. Yet within days, something impossible begins to happen. A 16-year-old farm girl named Emma starts bringing apples to the fence. A widowed Polish farmer finds himself depending on German hands to save his failing crops. And on Christmas Eve, the unthinkable occurs. Hank Kowalski, who lost his son fighting these very people, looks across his dinner table and does something that could change everything. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting your enemies, it's inviting them home for Christmas. If you want to hear more incredible untold stories that show humanity's power to surprise us, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how these forgotten moments of hope reach people around the world. The snow fell heavier than anyone could remember for mid-December in Texas, each flake catching the pale afternoon light as it drifted past the guard towers of the small prisoner-of-war camp outside Fredericksburg. Captain Robert Davis pulled his collar tighter against the unexpected cold, watching through his office window as local farmers gathered near the main gate, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Word had spread through the farming community that new prisoners were arriving, able-bodied workers who might help salvage what remained of the growing season and prepare for spring planting. The rumble of military trucks echoed across the frozen ground, and Davis stepped outside to oversee the transfer. 12 German prisoners would join the 43 already housed at his facility, bringing much-needed labor for the surrounding agricultural community. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and Davis took that responsibility seriously, having seen enough senseless cruelty during his service in the Great War to last several lifetimes. The first truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and Davis watched as 8 male prisoners climbed down. Their field gray uniforms worn but clean, their movements careful and controlled. The farmers nodded approvingly. These men looked strong enough for heavy work. But when the second truck's canvas cover was pulled back, a collective murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered crowd. 4 women stepped into the Texas snow, their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms torn and patched, their faces bearing the hollow exhaustion of soldiers who had traveled far from home. The eldest appeared to be in her 30s, moving with the precise bearing of someone trained in military protocol. The youngest looked barely out of her teens, clutching a small bundle of personal belongings against her chest. Hank Kowalski shifted uncomfortably among the other farmers, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. He had come seeking workers to help save his struggling farm, not expecting to see women who might remind him of his own daughter. His son Michael had died fighting Germans like these at Normandy just 6 months earlier, and the sight of enemy soldiers on American soil stirred something dark and complicated in his chest. "Captain Davis," Lieutenant Thompson appeared at his superior's elbow, clipboard in hand and regulation manual tucked under his arm. "The female prisoners present unique housing challenges. Regulations require separate quarters, additional security protocols, and modified work assignments." Davis nodded, already considering the logistics. The camp had been designed for male prisoners, but the converted farmhand quarters behind the main barracks could be adapted quickly. "Have Sergeant Martinez prepare the auxiliary building. Full privacy screens, separate latrine facilities, and double the usual security rounds." The eldest German woman stepped forward and addressed Davis in careful English. "I am Obergefreiter Greta Schneider, Wehrmacht Communications. These are Unteroffizier Ingrid Weber, Medical Corps, Gefreiter Anna Hoffman, Signals, and Gefreiter Liesel Brown. Supply." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, though her eyes remained respectfully lowered. "You'll be treated according to international law," Davis replied, noting how the other 3 women looked to Greta for guidance. Leadership emerged naturally, even in captivity. Sergeant Martinez will escort you to your quarters." As the women were led away, Davis overheard fragments of conversation among the farmers. Emma Kowalski, Hank's 16-year-old daughter, tugged at her father's coat sleeve. "Papa, they look so tired and cold." Her voice carried the innocent compassion that hadn't yet learned to distinguish between friend and enemy based on uniform alone. "They're prisoners, Emma," Hank replied gruffly, though his eyes followed the women with something that might have been concern. "Don't forget that." Maria Santos, who handled laundry for the camp and several local families, watched the women disappear into their new quarters. As a Mexican-American widow supporting 3 children, she understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion by a community that needed your labor but questioned your loyalty. The familiar ache of displacement stirred in her chest. That evening, as the camp settled into its routine, Greta sat on the edge of her narrow cot, carefully mending a tear in Liesel's uniform with thread salvaged from an old undershirt. The other women had already fallen into exhausted sleep, but Greta's mind refused to quiet. Through the small window, she could see lights in the farmhouses scattered across the Texas landscape, warm, golden rectangles that spoke of families gathered around dinner tables, children being tucked into bed, normalcy continuing despite the war that had torn her own world apart. She thought of her brother Klaus, whose letters had stopped coming after Stalingrad. The last one had described the terrible cold, the hunger, the way homesickness felt like a physical wound. Now she understood. But this American cold was different, sharper, cleaner somehow. It carried the scent of unfamiliar soil and the promise of a spring she might not live to see. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Ingrid stirred on her cot, instinctively reaching for the medical kit she kept within arm's reach even in sleep. The door opened to reveal Sergeant Martinez carrying a tray of hot coffee and thick slices of bread. "Captain's orders," he said simply, setting the tray on the small table. "Extra blankets, too. Gets cold here at night." After he left, the women gathered around the unexpected kindness, warming their hands on the ceramic cups. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the ersatz brew they had grown accustomed to, but it carried the unmistakable taste of abundance. Real coffee beans, real cream, the luxury of a nation not yet stripped bare by years of war. "They feed us better than our own army did," Anna whispered, almost afraid to speak the observation aloud. Greta nodded slowly, remembering the propaganda posters that had painted Americans as cruel oppressors who would show no mercy to captured enemies. Yet here they sat, warm and fed, treated with a dignity that contradicted everything they had been told. The realization was unsettling, like discovering that a fundamental truth about the world was actually a carefully constructed lie. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack. The sound was wild and lonely, but not threatening, just another creature trying to survive in an unforgiving world, much like themselves. The morning of December 21st dawned clear and bitter cold, with frost painting delicate patterns across the camp's windows. Emma Kowalski had risen before dawn to help her father with the livestock, but her thoughts kept drifting to the German women she had glimpsed through the fence the previous day. While Hank loaded feed into the truck, she slipped an apple from their winter stores into her coat pocket, along with a worn copy of Little Women that had belonged to her mother. The walk to the camp took 20 minutes through frozen fields, her boots crunching on snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early sunlight. At the fence line, she hesitated, suddenly uncertain about her impulse to reach across the divide between enemy and neighbor. The German women were in their small exercise yard, moving stiffly in the cold as they hung laundry on makeshift lines. Greta noticed the young American girl first, standing just beyond the wire with something clutched in her mittened hands. Their eyes met, and Emma stepped forward, extending the apple through the fence. "Guten Morgen," she said carefully, the German phrase awkward on her tongue but earnest in its intention. Greta's eyebrows rose in surprise. She approached slowly, as if sudden movements might frighten this unexpected kindness away. "Good morning," she replied in English, accepting the apple with careful reverence. The fruit was perfect, red and firm, the kind of simple abundance that had become a distant memory in war-torn Germany. "I brought a book, too," Emma whispered, glancing around to make sure no guards were watching. Do you like to read?" For the first time since her capture, Greta smiled. A real smile that transformed her gaunt features. "Very much. I was a teacher before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the uniform, the war, the impossible distance between her former life and this frozen Texas morning. Emma pushed the book through the fence. "It's about sisters, 4 sisters who take care of each other when their father is away at war." She paused, suddenly aware of the parallel. "Maybe it's silly giving this to you." "No," Greta said firmly, clutching the book to her chest. "Nothing kind is ever silly. Danke, thank you." She studied Emma's earnest face. "You speak some German. Where did you learn?" "My grandmother before she died. She came from the old country." Emma's cheeks reddened, not from cold, but from the admission of German heritage in a time when such connections felt dangerous to acknowledge. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Will Muller, who had been assigned to help in the camp infirmary. He carried a medical bag fashioned from canvas and salvaged supplies, his gentle manner immediately apparent as he nodded respectfully to both women. "Guten Morgen, Greta." "Fräulein," he added, addressing Emma with the same courtesy he might have shown a superior officer. Emma watched, fascinated, as Will examined a small cut on Ingrid's hand with the same careful attention her own doctor had shown when treating her family. These were supposed to be monsters according to the war posters in town, yet this man's touch was as gentle as any healer's. As the days passed, a careful routine developed. Captain Davis, recognizing the desperate need for agricultural workers in the community, authorized a limited work program. The male prisoners had already been assigned to various farms, but the women presented more complex considerations. After much deliberation and several heated discussions with Lieutenant Thompson about protocol, Davis agreed to allow 2 of the women to work at the Kowalski farm under strict supervision. Hank had requested workers with reluctant desperation, his pride warring with the practical reality that his crops wouldn't survive without help. When Greta and Ingrid arrived at his farm on the morning of December 22nd, accompanied by an armed guard who would return for them at sunset, he stood in his doorway watching them with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Papa assigned you to the barn," Emma said, leading them across the frozen farmyard. "The milk cows need tending, and there's equipment that needs repair before spring planting." Greta surveyed the barn with a practiced eye, noting the organization that spoke of years of careful stewardship. She had grown up on her uncle's farm outside Munich, and the rhythms of agricultural life were as familiar as breathing. Within minutes, she had assessed the situation and begun creating a systematic approach to the winter maintenance tasks. Ingrid moved among the livestock with the same gentle confidence she had shown in treating human patients. Her medical training had included veterinary basics, and she quickly identified a lame cow that had been favoring her left front hoof. "This one needs attention," she told Emma in careful English, pointing to the swollen joint. "Infection, maybe." "You have medicine for animals?" Emma led her to the farm's modest medical supplies, watching in amazement as Ingrid cleaned and treated the wound with professional competence. The cow, which had been skittish and difficult to handle for weeks, seemed to sense the woman's healing intention and stood quietly during the treatment. By midday, word of the German women's competence had spread among the farm workers. Hank himself appeared in the barn doorway, ostensibly to check on their progress, but actually driven by curiosity about these enemy soldiers who worked with such dedication. He found Greta organizing his spare equipment with military precision, creating an inventory system that would save hours during spring planting. "You know farming," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "My uncle had a farm in Bavaria," Greta replied, not looking up from her work. "Different crops, same principles. The land teaches you, if you listen." Something in her voice, a note of deep respect for the earth itself, gave Hank pause. These were the same words his own father had spoken when teaching him to read soil conditions and weather patterns. The realization was uncomfortable. suggesting connections that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and warfare. That evening, as the guard arrived to escort the women back to camp, Emma appeared with a thermos of hot soup and thick slices of fresh bread. "For the walk back," she explained, though the gesture was clearly motivated by something deeper than concern for physical comfort. Greta accepted the food with quiet gratitude, her eyes meeting Hank's across the farmyard. In that moment, both recognized something that would have been impossible to imagine just days earlier, the beginning of respect born from shared labor and mutual recognition of competence and character that existed independently of the uniforms they wore. The storm arrived without warning on the morning of December 23rd, transforming the Texas landscape into an impenetrable wall of white. What had begun as light snow flurries during breakfast became a howling blizzard by mid-morning, with winds that bent fence posts and visibility reduced to mere yards. At the Kowalski farm, Hank stood at his kitchen window, watching the world disappear behind curtains of driving snow, and realized with growing concern that Greta and Ingrid would not be returning to camp that evening. The two German women had arrived at dawn as usual, accompanied by their guard, but the soldier had departed after receiving radio orders about the approaching weather system. Camp protocol required all personnel to return to base during severe conditions, leaving the prisoners to shelter wherever they found themselves when the storm struck. It was an uncomfortable arrangement for everyone involved, particularly for Hank, who now faced the prospect of housing enemy soldiers under his own roof. Emma had developed a fever during the night, and by noon her temperature had climbed alarmingly high. She lay in her narrow bed, her cheeks flushed and her breathing labored, mumbling incoherently about school lessons and her mother's garden. Hank paced the small house, torn between his desire to reach the doctor in town and the impossibility of travel through the blizzard. The telephone lines were down, the roads impassable, and his daughter's condition was deteriorating with each passing hour. Ingrid appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and Emma's bedroom, snow still clinging to her uniform from her trek from the barn. She had been tending the livestock when the storm intensified, but the sound of Emma's distressed coughing had drawn her to the house. "The child is very sick," she said quietly, her English careful but clear. "May I examine her?" Hank's instinct was to refuse, to maintain the barrier between enemy and family, but Emma's labored breathing filled the silence that followed Ingrid's request. He looked at this German woman, this enemy who had spent the morning protecting his animals from the storm, and found himself nodding reluctantly. "What can you do?" Ingrid moved to Emma's bedside with the quiet confidence of someone trained to assess medical emergencies quickly. Her hands were gentle but thorough as she checked the girl's pulse, listened to her breathing, and examined her throat by lamplight. "Pneumonia, I think," she said finally. "Early stages, but serious. We must bring the fever down, keep her warm but not too warm, and help her breathe." For the next several hours, Ingrid worked with methodical care, applying cool compresses to Emma's forehead, administering small sips of water mixed with honey, and positioning pillows to ease the girl's breathing. Hank watched from the doorway, struck by the tenderness in the German woman's touch as she smoothed Emma's hair back from her fevered brow. It was the same gentle gesture his wife Mary had used during Emma's childhood illnesses, and the memory brought an unexpected tightness to his chest. Greta appeared periodically from the barn, where she had been ensuring the animals were secure against the storm. Each time she entered the house, she brought with her the sharp scent of snow and hay and news of the blizzard's unrelenting fury. The wind howled around the farmhouse like a living thing, rattling windows and finding every small gap in the walls where cold air could penetrate. As evening approached and Emma's fever began to break under Ingrid's careful ministrations, Hank found himself sharing the cramped kitchen space with his unexpected guests. The electricity had failed hours earlier, leaving them dependent on oil lamps and the warmth of the wood stove. In the flickering light, nationality seemed less important than the simple human need for warmth and companionship during nature's assault. "Your daughter is strong," Ingrid said softly, accepting a cup of coffee from Hank's trembling hands. "The fever is breaking. She will recover." Relief flooded through Hank so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. He sank into his chair at the kitchen table, suddenly aware of how frightened he had been. "I thought I might lose her, too," he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Greta looked up from the medical supplies she had been organizing. "Two?" Hank's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking an anchor in the storm of his own emotions. "My son, Michael, Normandy, 6 months ago. He was 19. The words felt heavy in the lamplight, carrying the weight of grief that had never fully lifted. The kitchen fell silent except for the wind's relentless howling and the distant sound of Emma's easier breathing. Greta set down the bandages she had been sorting and met Hank's eyes across the small table. "My brother Klaus, Stalingrad, 21 years old." Her voice carried the same hollow note of loss that had marked Hank's confession. They sat in the strange intimacy of shared sorrow, two parents who had lost children to a war neither fully understood anymore. The irony was not lost on either of them that their sons might have faced each other across some frozen battlefield, each fighting for causes that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of human cost. "Klaus wanted to be a teacher," Greta continued, her hands tracing patterns on the worn wooden table. "Like me. He said he would teach children to read poetry instead of propaganda." She paused, lost in memory. "I think he would have liked your Emma. She has a good heart." Hank nodded slowly, thinking of Michael's letters from training camp, full of boyish enthusiasm for adventure and duty. Michael wanted to come home and modernize the farm. New equipment, better irrigation. He had plans. The present tense slipped into past without his notice, a linguistic acknowledgement of finality he was still learning to accept. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the small farmhouse, something had shifted. Three people who should have been enemies found themselves united by grief, by the need to protect a sick child, and by the recognition that loss transcended the artificial boundaries of war. As midnight approached, Emma's breathing grew steady and peaceful, and Ingrid finally allowed herself to rest, curled in a chair beside the girl's bed like a guardian angel in a Wehrmacht uniform. Hank lay awake on his own bed, listening to the wind and processing the day's revelations. These German women had saved his daughter's life, had shown the same protective instincts any parent would recognize. The propaganda posters in town depicted enemy soldiers as inhuman monsters, but the reality sleeping in his kitchen was far more complicated and infinitely more human than he had ever imagined possible. Dawn on December 24th broke clear and crystalline, the storm having exhausted itself during the night and left behind a world transformed by pristine snow. Emma woke with her fever completely broken, her eyes bright and alert for the first time in days. She found Ingrid asleep in the chair beside her bed, still maintaining her protective vigil, and the sight filled the young girl with a warmth that had nothing to do with recovery from illness. Hank stood at his kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered fields in shades of rose and gold. The roads would be passable by afternoon, he judged, which meant the German women would return to camp and this strange interlude of enforced intimacy would end. The realization brought an unexpected sense of loss, as if something valuable was about to slip through his fingers. "Papa." Emma's voice from the bedroom doorway was still weak but clear. She moved slowly, Ingrid supporting her with gentle efficiency. "I'm hungry." Relief flooded through Hank at this simple declaration of returning health. "Pancakes," he announced, surprising himself with the decision. "Your mother always made pancakes when you were recovering from being sick." He began pulling ingredients from shelves and cupboards with more energy than he had felt in months. As the morning progressed and word spread through the community that the storm had passed, neighbors began arriving to check on the Kowalski farm. The first was Tom Bradley, whose own farm bordered Hank's property. He stomped snow from his boots on the porch, then stopped abruptly when he saw Greta organizing medical supplies at the kitchen table while Ingrid helped Emma eat breakfast. "Hank," Tom said carefully, his eyes fixed on the German women. "Everything all right here?" "Better than all right," Hank replied, flipping pancakes with steady hands. These women saved Emma's life. She had pneumonia, and they nursed her through the worst of it. His tone carried a quiet pride that surprised even him. Tom's expression shifted from suspicion to grudging respect as he watched Ingrid check Emma's pulse with professional competence. "That's so. Well, I suppose—" He trailed off, clearly struggling to reconcile his preconceptions with the evidence before his eyes. More neighbors arrived throughout the morning, drawn by curiosity about the storm's effects and word of the unusual situation at the Kowalski farm. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent property brought fresh bread, her usual gesture of neighborly care, but her eyes widened when she realized who was sharing the kitchen. Maria Santos appeared with extra blankets and a pot of hearty stew, her own experience as an outsider making her more accepting of the complicated circumstances. By noon, the small farmhouse had become an informal gathering place, with various community members coming and going, each processing the sight of enemy prisoners caring for an American child with the same tenderness they might show their own family. The conversations were stilted at first, marked by awkward silences and careful politeness, but gradually warmed as people witnessed Ingrid's gentle competence and Greta's thoughtful contributions to discussions about farming and community concerns. Father Heinrich arrived in the early afternoon, having made the difficult journey from town on snowshoes when he heard about the situation. The elderly Lutheran minister carried his worn Bible and the quiet authority of someone who had shepherded his flock through many difficult seasons. He observed the mixed gathering with thoughtful eyes, noting how naturally the German women had been integrated into the community's informal support network. "It seems God sent unexpected angels during the storm," he commented to Hank, watching as Greta helped Emma with a puzzle while Ingrid checked the girl's temperature once more. "Something like that," Hank agreed, though his voice carried undertones of confusion about the theological implications of finding salvation through enemy hands. The afternoon brought news that would shatter this fragile harmony. Captain Davis arrived with Lieutenant Thompson and a small military escort, their jeep navigating the cleared roads with official precision. The captain's face was grave as he approached the farmhouse, Thompson consulting his regulation manual with characteristic intensity. "Mr. Kowalski," Davis said formally, "I understand the storm necessitated emergency shelter arrangements. We're here to collect our prisoners." But Thompson stepped forward before Hank could respond, his young face flushed with righteous indignation. "Captain, I've received reports of unauthorized fraternization between prisoners and civilians. Furthermore, there are witnesses who claim these enemy soldiers were invited to participate in American family activities." His voice rose with each word, carrying the fervor of someone who saw clear violations of military protocol in every gesture of human kindness. Emma appeared in the doorway, pale but determined, her hand clutched protectively in Ingrid's. "They saved my life," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering. "When I was sick and Papa couldn't reach the doctor, Ingrid stayed up all night taking care of me." "That's irrelevant to military regulations," Thompson replied crisply. "These are enemy combatants, not medical personnel. Any treatment should have been provided by authorized American medical staff." The crowd of neighbors shifted uncomfortably, murmurs of protest beginning to rise. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his earlier suspicion replaced by protective loyalty. "Now, see here, Lieutenant. These women helped one of our own when no one else could. That ought to count for something." But Thompson was already consulting his manual, finding the sections that supported his position. Fraternization with enemy prisoners is strictly forbidden. Any civilian who has provided unauthorized comfort or assistance to captured combatants may be subject to investigation. His eyes swept the gathered crowd, noting faces and clearly planning his report. The moment crystallized around a terrible choice between human decency and institutional authority. Davis stood caught between his personal recognition of the women's character and his responsibility to military discipline. The community members faced the realization that kindness itself had become a form of resistance that could bring consequences. In that charged atmosphere, With Emma's recovery serving as living testament to unexpected mercy, Hank made a decision that would echo through all their lives. He stepped forward, placing himself physically between the German women and Thompson's accusatory glare. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "tomorrow is Christmas. These women helped save my daughter when she was dying. If that's wrong, according to your books, then maybe it's the books that need changing." Emma impulsively stepped forward and extended a small carved wooden angel toward Greta, a Christmas gift she had been crafting in secret. "I want you to have this," she said softly, "to remember that not all Americans think you're monsters." The gesture hung in the crystalline air like a challenge to everything the war had taught them about enemies and allies, about the boundaries that should exist between nations at war, and about the possibility that Christmas might mean more than political expedience or military protocol. Lieutenant Thompson's clipboard hit the ground with a sharp crack as Emma's wooden angel passed from her small hands to Greta's trembling fingers. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, followed immediately by Thompson's crisp command. "Captain Davis, I'm placing these civilians under investigation for violation of military security protocols. The prisoners will be confined to quarters immediately, and any further contact between them and American civilians is hereby forbidden." The drive back to camp passed in tense silence, Greta clutching Emma's carved angel as if it were a lifeline. The Jeep's tires crunched through snow that had seemed beautiful hours earlier, but now felt like a barrier separating her from the first genuine kindness she had experienced since her capture. Through the rear window, she watched the Kowalski farmhouse grow smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the brief illusion that enemies might become something more human. Christmas morning dawned gray and bitter, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. In their confined quarters, the 4 German women sat in dejected silence, listening to the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to worship across Fredericksburg. The bells seemed to mock their isolation, each bronze note a reminder of celebrations happening beyond their reach, of families gathering in warmth while they remained locked away like dangerous animals. Greta turned Emma's wooden angel over in her hand, studying the careful detail work that spoke of hours spent carving hope into wood. The angel's face was serene, its wings spread as if in protection, and tiny letters spelled out peace along the base in both English and what appeared to be Emma's attempt at German script. The gift represented everything the war had taught her not to expect: thoughtfulness from enemies, beauty created in the midst of hatred, the possibility that individual hearts could transcend the poisonous rhetoric of nations in conflict. "They were going to invite us to Christmas dinner," Liesel whispered, breaking the morning's oppressive quiet. "Emma told me yesterday before the storm. She was so excited to share their traditions with us." Anna nodded miserably. Mrs. Santos mentioned it too. She said the whole community was talking about it, some for and some against, but Mr. Kowalski had decided we were welcome at his table. She wiped away tears with the back of her hand. "Now we'll never know what American Christmas tastes like." At the main camp, Captain Davis stood at his office window, watching snow begin to fall again and wrestling with the most difficult command decision of his military career. Thompson's report lay on his desk, meticulously documenting every breach of protocol, every moment of unauthorized human connection between prisoners and civilians. By regulation, the lieutenant was absolutely correct. By conscience, Davis knew the report represented everything wrong with a war that had forgotten how to recognize basic human decency. The sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention to the camp's main gate, where an unexpected procession was forming in the falling snow. Father Heinrich led the way, carrying his worn Bible and walking with the steady determination of someone on a sacred mission. Behind him came Maria Santos with a large basket, followed by Tom Bradley and Mrs. Henderson and at least a dozen other community members, each carrying dishes or packages wrapped in cloth. Most surprising of all, Hank Kowalski walked near the rear of the group, Emma at his side despite her recent illness, both carrying portions of what was clearly a complete Christmas feast. The girl's pale face was set with the same stubborn determination that had characterized her recovery, and she clutched a second wooden angel that she had apparently carved through the night. Lieutenant Thompson intercepted the group at the guard post, his regulation manual prominently displayed. "This gathering is unauthorized," he announced. "The prisoners are confined to quarters and no civilian contact is permitted under current security protocols." Father Heinrich stepped forward, his gentle authority making Thompson's youth and inexperience suddenly apparent. "Lieutenant, I've come to conduct Christmas services for the German prisoners, as is my right under the Geneva Convention. These good people have come to observe the holy day in Christian fellowship, which I believe transcends the temporary boundaries of warfare." "The regulations are clear," Thompson insisted, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "No unauthorized contact, no special privileges that might be construed as preferential treatment." "Then let's authorize it," Captain Davis said, emerging from his office with deliberate calm. He had reached his decision, and the weight of command responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "Father Heinrich, you have permission to conduct services. The civilian observers may remain in the camp common area, maintaining appropriate distance from prisoner quarters." Thompson's face flushed red. "Sir, this directly contradicts the security protocols outlined in—" "Lieutenant," Davis interrupted firmly, "it's Christmas Day. These people have come in peace to observe their faith alongside former enemies who showed extraordinary kindness to one of their children. Unless you can demonstrate a specific security threat that outweighs the Geneva Convention's provisions for religious observance, I'm authorizing this gathering." Within an hour, an impromptu outdoor Christmas service had formed along the fence line that separated the prisoner quarters from the camp's common area. Father Heinrich conducted the service in both German and English, his words about peace on earth and goodwill toward all mankind carrying extra weight in the crisp winter air. The German prisoners stood on one side of the fence, the American civilians on the other, but the physical barrier seemed to dissolve as voices joined in familiar hymns. When Emma stepped forward and passed her second carved angel through the fence to Anna, no one moved to stop her. Maria Santos followed with portions of her traditional Christmas tamales, sharing them with Ingrid through the wire mesh. Mrs. Henderson offered homemade cookies, Tom Bradley contributed fresh bread, and gradually the fence line became a communion table where former enemies shared the abundance of the season. Hank approached Greta slowly, carrying a plate laden with Christmas dinner and struggling with emotions he couldn't entirely name. "I told my daughter I'd make sure you knew you were welcome at our table," he said quietly, passing the food through the fence. "Distance doesn't change that." As snow began to fall more heavily, turning the gathering into a scene that might have emerged from a Christmas card, voices began to blend in Silent Night, sung simultaneously in German and English, creating a harmony that transcended language and nationality. Greta held both of Emma's wooden angels, understanding finally that some gifts were too precious to be diminished by war, and some moments of grace were powerful enough to crack open the hardest hearts. Lieutenant Thompson stood apart from the gathering, his regulation manual forgotten at his feet, watching Americans and Germans share Christmas dinner across a fence that suddenly seemed more symbolic than real. For the first time since arriving at the camp, he questioned whether strict adherence to rules might sometimes prevent the very outcomes those rules were designed to protect.